VR, virtual reality. You put these goggles on your face, it takes you to a different place. Then you pick up these manettes, or controllers, or whatever you want to call them, and in their position you see your hands. Forget about stereoscopic 3D, I think the real gimmick to VR is this: movement. In VR, your agency is an interpolation of 3 points. Your left hand, your right hand, and your big fat head. Mounted by a large electronic headset, your head controls an in-game camera, which, via some sort of complex motion tracking system, a computer is triangulating and rendering the perspective of in real time. The fact that the view is displayed within the headset creates the illusion of presence. You look to the left and to the right, the computer reads your inputs and displays the appropriate view. Same for your controllers, except in this case, their coordinates are used to display hands in the right position relative to the perspective of your headset. The technology, in an abstract sense, is just a system for controlling 2 points of manipulation from a third point of perspective. And in my opinion, that's magical enough on its own, without mentioning the fact that this is being presented twice at once from viewports a few inches apart to simulate 3D vision. Look, even if you load up your favorite VR game under an eye patch, it's still a radically different experience than playing a 2D game on a 2D monitor. Your lack of depth perception might make it a little bit harder to gain perspective, but you're still interacting with the game in a fundamentally different way than you would otherwise, because you can move your head and hands. You know, 3D and motion controls are both innovations that have had the chance to come independently to games. Only one of these flew off store shelves, while the other was reduced to a doorstop. When it comes to gaming, taking physical control of some aspect of play is evidently more engaging than three-dimensional depth. Motion controls are something that have existed for a few decades now. Over time, we've seen some very clever implementations, some good applications, and of course some bad and mediocre ones. What separates the meat from the calf is something I like to call simulative control. Basically, does the game effectively simulate the task it's asking the user to actively perform? One way to put it is like, say you've got a sports game. Now, how much of an advantage would a professional athlete have in playing it? Of course, the markets for these sorts of games are much broader than, pro tennis players or whatever. And what's neat is that this is as much of a game design and software development challenge as it is an interface one. I mean, is it really necessary to simulate the complex mechanics, by which I mean, like, the physics of an environment just for some goofy game that most people are going to be playing in their pajamas at a retirement home? Probably not, which is why it's okay to cheat a little.
Yeah, look at that.
The classic example is Wii Sports, which cleverly hid its actual controls within the motion as gestures. You're not in one-to-one control of your avatar the entire time, but in using your controllers to complete certain predefined gestures, you could trigger associated predefined behaviors. For example, in the most complex game from the lot, boxing, each type of punch was triggered by a unique rotation and movement direction of the controller. When you break it down, it's not much different than a plain digital input, like pressing down 2 buttons at once. In VR, though, there seems to be more interest from developers in making realistic sims. This is King Spray, a virtual reality graffiti simulator made by a 4-person team, some EA and Pandemic veterans among them, who evidently also had some personal interest and or experience with the art. What sets it apart from other games is its simplicity and accuracy. There's no fancy bells or whistles, you're not dancing around shooting robots or anything, it's basically just one system. One super crisp and detailed system, that of paint stored in a pressurized aerosol can being ejected through a nozzle and hitting a surface. Now that might sound like an overly verbose way of saying, hey, these guys simulated spray paint, and yeah, that's because it is. From the way paint collects on a surface as it dries, to the way it drips as it accumulates, to the way it spreads as it's smeared from different angles, every relevant detail that exists about the real-world process of producing graffiti is coded into this game. What drew my attention to it was a series by BuzzFeed Multiplayer called Professionals Play, where they got professional graffiti artist The Walking Giant to don the headset and just paint some murals. My favorite thing about these videos is how many times he catches himself off guard, instinctively using some technique he knows from the real world, and then blowing his own mind when he realizes that it actually worked.
Oh, you could even flare in here. Dude, that's so sick. I just did that on accident.
A common theme among his commentaries is that his creativity and skills and experience with this art aren't inhibited in any way by the VR system. It turns out the interface gives him enough touch points to fully affect what he wants to, how he wants to.
And what's really cool about this VR system, it's really accurate. Like, I could get exactly what I want. I get to create my vision. Like, I thought the VR system would, like, hinder my ability to paint my vision, but no, I get to paint exactly what I want, how I want to get the lines where I want them.
But the headset and controllers are only half of it. The remainder, which drives this sort of experience home, is the design and implementation of the intricate and complex software system that he's interfacing with. The fact that when he attempts to do a flare, or a fade, or a highlight, or an inlight, or a shadow, or whatever the fuck, the fact that the systems respond appropriately, that's the magic. Now, of course, one of the only reasons any of this is possible is because spray paint is a relatively low complexity system to simulate. It also benefits from a phenomena I like to call the dependent expertise confirmation effect. Basically, if completing a task or project requires some level of expertise or tacit knowledge in some particular field, odds are depictions, implementations, or representations of that field in the work will not only be easier to complete by those working on it, but will also be more accurate. Basically, if half or more of your team is technical artists, and being a technical artist means you understand the fundamentals of some art production, representing and technically implementing an artistic process is going to be relatively less complex, and the end result will likely be more faithful. I hope you like pictures of Squidward. It's the only thing I can consistently draw the same way twice. That tacit knowledge of a certain domain makes it a lot easier to communicate about from an experienced perspective, or in the case of Kingspray, build a simulator of. The point here though is that this isn't some crazy dynamic combat simulator with realistic ballistics they were building here. Kingspray is a game about a relatively simple art made by artists, and so it's super accurate in terms of realism, and this is what allowed an artist like the Walking Giant to effectively import into the game his personal skills which had only ever since been practiced in the real world. Interestingly enough, he's actually now started his own channel where he records more of his own graffiti sim sessions and even makes tutorials. Think of it this way. If either of the two pieces that made this work were absent, his skills wouldn't have translated. If the game's core was the same, but instead you interacted with it via an Xbox controller, he wouldn't be able to do exactly what he wants. And if the game were still in VR, but the paint simulation wasn't accurate, then again, no real-world experience could help him. He'd effectively have to relearn how to do graffiti within the context of the game's laws. Last year I made a video about virtual reality games, and I read as an example a suggestion someone had to the industry to purposely make guns behave unrealistically in order to mitigate the potential effect these sorts of games could have at teaching people violent skills. Don't get me wrong, it's a super dumb idea, but trying to do graffiti in an imperfect sim would sort of be the same thing. If it's not close to realism, then, especially in VR, what's the point, right? Here's a concrete example of an unrealistic VR game that you can spend $30 on if you're a loser. Creed Rise to Glory isn't so much a boxing simulator as it is a professional boxer simulator. What does that mean? Well, it means that unlike Kingspray, it's a role-playing game in a sense. Kingspray isn't a graffiti artist simulator, it's a graffiti simulator. Its systems are just those of the paint hitting concrete, and so what you're able to do in there is up to your own skills. If you're good at art, you'll be good at the game, and if you're not, then the game won't make you better. Creed goes for the opposite approach and instead has a design that's filled with compensations for you to be able to control the main character. The layer of game design that sits between the player's inputs and the character are meant to level the playing field, but unfortunately what they end up doing is impeding your raw skill and performance from making it into the game. Now, I'm not saying that I'm a professional boxer, but I don't have the same tiredness meter as Creed here does. So while I'm still feeling fit to fight and I'm wailing my arms around like crazy, but my avatar is tired and the game removes my one-to-one control and installs in its place a forceful lag between my movements and his, it feels like interference, like I'm a boxer's muffled puppeteer rather than a fighter myself. And worse, when I actually am tired but my character isn't, the game's constant prompts to take action just make me feel like a stupid idiot. Why don't you just let me get tired on my own, right? Fuck your sweat meter or whatever. Don't worry, I'm fat as fuck. I'm gonna get tired. BuzzFeed also got an Olympic boxer to play Creed, and the fact that she got knocked out in the first two fights more times than I did is evidence that this kind of design, which purposefully transforms or mutates the player's control, obstructs a person's natural skill from being transported into the sim. Instead, what proved in this case to be more useful was an ability I had that she didn't, the superpower I've developed over years of playing video games to quickly read design cues. Now, of course, boxing is an intense combat sport, and one of the best examples of something we might not be able to simulate accurately without specialized hardware and a lot more moving parts, unlike spray painting. And at that point, if you're donning a headset to play sim boxing against an actual punching robot, you're basically just boxing, right? Combat like this is something that's incredibly hard to simulate, and Creed is just one example of a game that tries its best to compensate for that with game design and a phantom melee system that ultimately sacrifices the authenticity of the experience it markets itself on. So we've seen that if simulated with some minimum amount of accuracy, which is proportional to the complexity of the experience being represented, then someone's skills at that task can be translated into the virtual world. An artist can load up a sim and paint to their heart's content, their creativity uninhibited. If anything, I'd argue extended, given the option to control or toggle off aspects of reality that they're not fans of. So, question is, could someone with little to no prior experience in something complex learn and become skilled at it by practicing in VR and then take that to the streets? I tried answering a similar question last year, and the answer was no. But maybe I was injecting a little too much specifics into it, because our artist friend seems to think so.
Dude, it's crazy, man. I feel like I'm actually painting as far as like my physical body-wise. Like, to me, this is like doing graffiti on paper times 1,000. If I got into graffiti using this video game, dude, I would be way like ahead of my time.
Another key place to look for evidence of VR being able to teach us skills which might be taken into the real world is within its applications in the training industry. Outside of gaming and entertainment and design visualization, the industry most host to VR applications is training, an umbrella that encompasses everything from immersive teaching programs that are mostly social in nature, to ones that, paired with other hardware and peripherals, aim to simulate not just the visual components of some scenario, but even the tactile or kinesthetic experience. There are two main reasons why VR is such a good match for learning. First, there's the cost factor. When it comes to deploying or purchasing a training service or learning platform, the obvious costs are things like material and personnel, i.e. what does it take to run, how many people are needed for it to work, how long does it take, etc. Imagine a training course which after every time you go through it, you need to set it all back up for your next run. Physical courses like this might even spend consumable resources on every turn, like military training, which might take place in a set but can call for expenditures of real-life fuel and munitions. In the real world, things are spent, expelled, broken, and worn out. In 2012, actively operating an F-16 fighter jet for an hour would cost about $25,000. It's hard to find a specific number to compare against for simulators, since often their cost is packaged with curriculums, and more often than not purchased at large scale by governments, but still, sources cite the cost as being substantially lower than the real thing, which is easy to believe. Some lower-end sim hardware can be found in the ranges of hundreds of dollars, and software licenses for about the same. Believe it or not, some old military flight sims have been gamified and commercialized. For example, the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum, which charges less than 60 Canadian bucks for a 1-hour mission in what apparently is a real F-18 flight simulator. Definitely not one from this decade, though. It feels unfair to compare these numbers, but if I had to wager, I'd say the hourly cost of a modern military flight sim is a lot closer to this one than that. According to a source in the US Air Force, not only is it significantly cheaper, but it can help save time, account for different scenarios, and is much safer. When it comes to flying C-17s, students spend 136.5 hours in the simulator and only 18 hours in real aircraft. Why did I say real like that? Over the course of their classes. It's fun. Anyways, fucking kill me. Even non-pilot Air Force roles, like Loadmasters, the professional Tetris players in charge of the cargo bay, spend more time practicing with computer sims than real planes or even scale replicas. All this because the familiarization they can develop in the sim apparently translates well enough to the real multi-million-dollar hardware at a cost that's almost negligible compared to the alternative and its risks. In the simulator, the paint isn't real, it doesn't run out. The fuel isn't real, it doesn't exist. The risk isn't real, the payload isn't real, hell, the plane isn't even real. But what is, or is close enough so they say, is the experience in the mind of the trainee. It's at least real enough that they can take the lessons learned into the real. Important to note, these sorts of environments aren't normally just open-air sims where the player can do whatever they want and test its limits, like a blank canvas in an alley. Most of these sorts of sims would be better described as platforms for tutorialized content. Often they're even sold in two parts, first as a piece of hardware which runs a simulation software, and second as a lesson plan or by a lesson-by-lesson basis. You sell the platform first, then the content. First you might buy the huge rig, and second you'd subscribe to the lesson plan. Something like that. You know, recurring revenue model. This is the software business, baby! Then there's the tricky costs that are easy to neglect. The main costs of operating a lesson stand out for sure, but now that you've got your training program, how are you going to deploy it? Can everyone who needs to take it feasibly be transported to where it is? There are costs obviously involved in moving people and materials for training, and it's unfortunate that this has to factor in when a company is deciding whether or not it can afford to upgrade to a newer and safer equipment that might require some sort of safety course certification to use. Oof. Well, introducing, from the people who brought you your mom and dad's favorite website, this fancy techno headset thing. Now, as an employee, I can take a standardized physical training program from the comfort of literally any fucking where. And as a company, all I need to do is send out a couple of computers and headsets for folks to train on to possibly greatly reduce the training cost. This is an oversimplification, of course, but it highlights some of the motivating factors companies have to purchase or develop virtual training programs over traditional. Not only that, but a standalone advantage to a digital training platform like VR is that physical training exercises can be standardized. With VR, you can guarantee that the same training will be delivered in the same way every time. Something you just can't do when it comes to real-world training and the many factors that can play into how experiences can vary from one instance to the next. The second and more questionable and interesting reason VR has clung to the training industry is its effectiveness. First, it's important to note that VR training didn't initially come to be because anyone ever found out that it was a very effective way to learn. It's the cost and risk mitigation factors that are solely to credit for motivating anyone to invest in computerized training in the first place. A lot of these programs got started in the early days because, in some cases, there just wasn't any way to build an effective real-world analog to a setting that either cost a reasonable amount or wasn't too dangerous to subject a student to. The only reason the first computerized and then VR training managed to grab a foothold was because they were certainly better than non-practical learning like on-paper assessments. But after decades of use and improvement and study, turns out knowledge and experience you pick up in a simulation, if directed correctly, can be generalized to the real world. In other words, unlike other media which your brain will often put a fence around and typically not grab from when trying to reason about the real world, things you do and see in VR are a degree enough more realistic that you interpret them realistically, both in the way that you're able to learn from them and in the way that you naturally respond physiologically. If the simulation is accurate enough, if it has great enough fidelity, then even though you're fully aware that it's not, the learning can be real. So if you're preparing for a public service role, say you're going to be operating the front desk of a high-end hotel or working the floor of a fancy restaurant, well, odds are you'll first make it out of a hospitality training school. But once you've been in the field for a few years and it's time to brush up on modern practices, instead of elaborate orientations or going back to school, why not do it in VR?
Wonderful. Can I get you anything to eat?
I'll have the eggs Benedict, please.
Delicious.
Big companies like Hilton are investing in this tech for their hospitality employees, but also their bigwigs who often have not worked the front line of a hotel themselves and can use VR to help them understand the perspective of the people whose day-to-day their decisions control, and also not risk losing any customers in the process. With pre-recorded assets and design scenarios, a standardized customer service training program can be deployed like that.
If we were to try to do this in a traditional setting, when you have 400,000 team members, that is not something that comes in an inexpensive way for us, and nor do I think it's realistic.
It turns out the sense of presence we human beings feel in VR helps us retain more from it, and it's definitely more effective than one of those lame HR videotapes. You'd be surprised at how many different groups are doing stuff like this right now. You know, simple environmental conditioning training for people in customer-facing roles. Simulators that pit you against virtual entitled shoppers to prepare you for the real thing. Of course, that same property of VR experiences, presence, also aids in learning practical skills. If a sim is modeled accurately, if it handles the way it should and feels the way it should, you can learn something from it, like how to handle specific pieces of machinery or equipment. And this isn't just some fancy talk, and it's also not, as it might be with the military, a case of people having so much funding they've got nothing better to do with it. There's research to back this up. Studies of all sorts of different training programs for specific pieces of machinery, my favorite example being powered wheelchairs, have shown signs of increased learning when trainees use VR as opposed to other methods. A study on memory aid applications showed that people have nearly a 9% easier time remembering information that they learned in VR as opposed to on a 2D screen. And according to a 2019 literature review, around half of studies of virtual reality in educational settings positively showed that it granted learning benefits, whether it be in the form of better test scores or some other measurement, especially in procedural tasks, ultimately finding evidence that the virtual skill acquisition could be transferred successfully to real-world problems and scenarios. Real-world problems and scenarios like, I don't know, operating a firearm? I'm not sure. But just saying though, if this article had been out a year prior, fucking hell would I have made it my smoking gun. It's too perfect. It's just too perfect. Even their last remark is that effective behavioral change is going to be important to investigate further. This is like exactly the sort of study I needed in my 2019 video. Look, I'm happy with that thing, but I swear the amount of shit that came out and happened in the VR scene immediately after it, god damn, I was just a year too early. The psychological process that the VR's effectiveness as a medium for learning has been attributed to is embodied cognition. Basically, it's the theory that cognition is influenced by our entire body and all of its senses. So what that means for Sims is that the more levels they can stimulate you on, the closer they can design it to feel like the real thing, the better your retention should be. I almost feel like this should go without saying. I mean, here's a really dumb and a really simple example, and an excuse to use some Phasmo footage, but this is an infrared thermometer in a ghost hunting game. It's modeled after a real thing that you can go out and buy. And assuming it works the way it should, then in picking it up and virtually waving it around to take temperature readings in different rooms, in 2 seconds I've learned how to use it, and if ever I were presented with an actual one, I'd know my way around it. It's a simple device that learning to use in VR feels intuitive, and in very little time I've gained a practical understanding of it that beats reading an instruction manual or watching a tutorial. Like I said though, this one is a pretty basic device. You can find many simulations of much more complex tools and processes in the world of workplace safety simulators. Here, another aspect of VR which makes it a uniquely effective learning platform is leveraged. That is that, in its artificiality, physical risk is completely removed. A high-rise construction worker can be lectured day in, day out about safety procedures. You can present them with as many goofy safety training videos and stage accident montages as you want, but nothing quite compares to learning from a mistake and facing the outcome firsthand. In a virtual environment, you can show someone why it's important to tether themselves. You can suspend them 30 stories up in the air. You can safely test their commitment to protocols in a secure, interactive environment with actual fail states. The prevalence of these kinds of sims, as well as the estimated investment in the field based on developer survey results, would seem to suggest that they're pretty effective. I'd wager more so than the incentive structure in place currently on construction sites, often in the form of monitoring systems that fine companies and workers for safety violations after the fact. You know, there's a difference between going, "Hey Pete, be sure to wear your hard hat when you're on the site, or else the artificial intelligence overlord's gonna send you a bill, eh?" and going, "Hey Pete, wanna see what it looks like to fall from 100 feet in the air?" and put on this headset. Real-world training has a critical disadvantage in that it can't raise the stakes to the point of realistic risk. When you're testing against danger, it comes to a point that it's not worth it. It's not worth injuring the trainee or damaging or even building the test equipment in the first place. What's the point of constructing a training stage, say for a fire safety drill, if the fire needs to be real and can actually burn it all down? You're not just training anymore. I mean that's a real fucking fire. In VR, though, you can put someone in virtual danger. You can design a fail state into the scenario that actually kills the trainee. You can send them plummeting to the ground, light them on fire, allow them to crash their car or their plane or their train. You can show them a real game over. The risk being omitted means that you can train in VR specifically for risky scenarios. The types of situations that someone otherwise can read about or try to mentally prepare themselves for, sure, but outside of VR can't appropriately condition themselves to or learn about unless they unfortunately find themselves in it for real and live to tell the tale. There's a reason I've been talking about how military pilots train instead of how commercial ones do. Both do undergo sim training, yes, but it's the kind of operations and the risks being tested against which differentiates what Toms Cruise and Hanks are prepping for. As a matter of fact, military pilots don't suddenly stop training in flight sims once they graduate. It's an ongoing part of their service, and in their own words, they're not using it just to learn, but to become experts. The simulators are a tool they use as part of their regular training to equip themselves with the skills and mental protocols for emergency scenarios they'd ideally not want to get into in an actual jet unless they had to. Missions which no real-life training could cover effectively without putting them or their surroundings in real danger. The basic stuff you can get a grasp of quickly and even practice in the real sky, but how are you supposed to prepare for aerial combat without putting yourself, your teammates, and your equipment at risk? You can't learn from your mistakes if your mistakes fucking kill you, right? The sim might not be real, but it's better than not being able to practice for risky exercises at all. Now, of course, this sort of VR isn't the same as what's available to the average consumer today, and part of that is because fighter pilots already have a heads-up display that they need to learn with, so big clunky virtual reality goggles that get in the way are a no-no. Same goes for other forms of virtual and computerized vehicle training. Most of it is done with real hardware, sitting on big fancy controlled training stages with screens in front of them. But the VR systems used for infantry and police training, well, these look a lot more like the sort of thing you can buy off the shelf at Best Buy. Let's hold on to this thought for later, though.
The same way that every pilot uses a flight simulator and you wouldn't get on a plane with a pilot who hadn't used one, we think policing is going to go the same way.
So to wrap up this idea, VR and its sister technologies are currently being employed at an industrial scale around the world as learning, training, and low-risk practice tools. People are regularly hopping into the virtual world to improve their performance of complex tasks, ranging from those purely social to high-intensity combat drills. All this in controlled, standardized, and safe environments where costs are kept as low as possible. If the system is designed so well that it adheres to a certain level of realism, then not only can one's real-world experience be carried over into the simulation, but also the psychological processes by which we're able to learn can be activated. If this happens, then over long enough sessions, someone can realistically carry out of their experience in the sim skills applicable in the real world. This is fact. Otherwise, we'd probably see a hell of a lot more plane crashes. To this point, one thing that is a pretty big part of society, for better or for worse, is driving. For that reason, over the years, it's been the focus of a lot of study. But often, instead of experimenting with real cars and real scenarios, for safety purposes and also ease of data collection, a lot of studies put participants in elaborate driving sims, implicitly revealing that they believe that the results from the sim should be generalizable to the real world. A belief that they're allowed to have because studies past have validated driving simulators as good tools for driving assessments, sufficiently representative of real human-to-car interactions. Speaking of driving, it's a skill that some people are better at than others. Some people even do it competitively and professionally. Racing cars for sport has been a popular pastime for people ever since I got tired of horses. I don't know, this is an awful segue. Just like the industrial-grade simulators we've already seen, big professional racing sim rigs have been a staple part of racers' diets for a long time. Originally, their main use was to prepare the sport's participants for the layouts of the circuits they'd be running. With tracks all over the world and transporting and allocating resources a struggle, getting every driver the real-world practice they need is just an impossibility. So instead, drivers have traditionally spent their time in fancy video games to get to know the layouts of their tracks, but not learn much else about what to expect on race day. See, racing is an incredibly complex sport. For a long time, the computational power and development resources necessary to accurately model every system needing accounting for in a single lap just didn't exist. It's not so simple as paint on a wall. But over time, things change. Technologies advance, our understandings of physical processes are broadened, hobbyists funnel their passions into projects, and what starts as a school assignment becomes one of the most popular racing simulators on the market. Today, a piece of software like Assetto Corsa, a racing simulator that costs $20 on Steam and integrates with basically any dedicated racing sim hardware you can get your hands on, knock 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 including VR headsets, today a tool like this can be used by racers for a lot more than just memorizing the turns before they hit the track. Want to talk about tacit knowledge getting into the project? It was made by Italians. The degree of realism in its interconnected systems, as well as the performance of its different cars and the accuracy with which some of its tracks have been modeled using laser scan data, is such that the racers can get a closer to real-life experience driving in it. A driver and racing instructor like Scott Manzel can practice 70 laps in the sim for a track he's never been on using a Ferrari he hasn't actually sat in yet, then travel across the world and show up and apply the same speeds, turns, and even considerations for tire degradation to pull off times remarkably close to what he expects.
And I mean, it just goes to show you that the sim isn't just for learning circuits. You know, I often hear real world drivers say, well, I just use it for learning circuits but not much more. We're discovering that actually the tyre models are so accurate now that we can work on when the balance disappears in the car as the tyres gradually degrade going through a session, and also stuff on like technique on how you trail brake and building that rhythm as a driver and maximising the performance of the car.
And yes, just to cover my ass, this guy does sell his own racing sim lessons, so he definitely has motive to sing these praises. But the performances of him and his student, both on this track for their first time, is something I have difficulty explaining if it's not the case that the practice they got in VR, and in particular this high-fidelity simulator, gave them a measurable advantage in the real world. I mean, to be fair, with stories about esports drivers getting drafted into real racing, I don't think it's that hard to believe. But the reason I bring this up is because, unlike big industrial strength training shit, racing sims and the specialized controller interfaces and VR components that we can attach to them are all commercially available things. This is a case where the same stuff that professionals use is also accessible to the rest of the world. If you're really into motorsport, then setting up your own rudimentary sim hub is not that difficult. I mean, I wouldn't say that I'm so into it myself, but plug in a cheap USB racing wheel and my headset, and spend 20 Canuck bucks on a game on Steam, I've got myself a setup not too many degrees of difference from what the pros are using. But like I said, not super into racing. I'm kind of actually an anxious driver. I mean, generally I'm a pretty anxious person, it runs in the family, but in particular I'm very anxious about driving in real life. Despite being a very cautious driver and having had honestly no real close calls in a real car before, my most recurring nightmares for some reason are about getting myself into an accident. And it's always the same way too. Either I slide on ice or my brakes fail coming to a stop and I smack into the car in front of me. It's just really distressing and I have trouble getting a handle on it sometimes. Because of this, ever since I adopted VR, one of my goals has been to find a decent VR driving sim. Not a racing sim, a real driving sim. Like a substitute to a course or something. Just to condition myself to worry less. Sadly, I haven't really found a decent one yet. But what's interesting is that basically what I've been on the lookout for was a way to treat my anxieties through what's called immersion therapy. I like to think of therapy as a not-so-distant cousin to the training industry. Here, instead of conditioning someone to the environment of their job, therapy, specifically that which treats traumas and phobias, is about conditioning people to the presence of things that trigger a harmful response in them. One of the most effective ways of treating these sorts of disorders is by exposing subjects to their triggers in a controlled setting and slowly ramping it up. This is an oversimplification, but you got arachnophobia? Okay, instead of avoiding spiders for the rest of your life, they're gonna make you look at a spider behind glass or something. It shouldn't be surprised then to learn that, given the same reasons that it's been found to be an effective tool for learning, therapists have leveraged VR applications for a broad range of treatments. Sorry for sounding like a broken record, I have talked about this a lot before, but the difference today is that VR, having now been validated, has moved on from research and clinical trial to clinical practice. It's no longer just researchers making claims about its effectiveness. Now it's hit the ground and people are using it for real. Companies that specialize in it are sharing their stats and learning new things. For example, maybe an unexpected positive consequence that, I guess makes more sense to measure from a money-making perspective, but because VR is less threatening or intense than IRL therapy, patients with specific anxiety conditions are much less likely to refuse it or drop out before they're done. For examples of specific conditions currently being treated by clinicians with VR, you've got claustrophobia, zoophobia, there's a lot of bug stuff, fear of flying, stress and anxieties in places like school or medical settings is something I've personally struggled with and, fitting into the statistics, dropped out of therapy for after my first session. You've even got treatments for issues like addiction and eating disorders, and I think possibly my favorite application, public speaking. This shit looks so cool. Now, I may have never found a casual driving sim up to my standards to help me out with my stress, but I have actually used a VR game to help me deal with another personal issue of mine. I used Penn and Teller's shitty, gimmicky Magic VR game to self-administer immersion therapy and help me resolve a trauma I incurred as a teenager involving a vivid and, for the record, uninfluenced hallucination of Penn Jillette standing in my bedroom screaming at me, which, yes, I'm playing up here for comedic effect, but to be fair, was a very fucking scary experience that this game kinda did help me work through. Also, I am aware of the irony that the specific person who I witnessed, apparate, traumatize me, and then disappear from my bedroom is none other than one of the world's greatest magicians. So yes, the thought has crossed my mind that I may have in fact not hallucinated, and then Penn Jillette is actually an even greater magician than anyone in the world but myself knows. I don't know what kind of therapy I need to cover that one. This is a really weird aside, but feel like I should reiterate, I was not on anything. I saw a doctor about this. Apparently it's normal for some people, like me, to have extremely vivid hallucinations shortly after waking up or before falling asleep. I do still have them sometimes, though they're much less magical than they used to be when I was a kid and a teenager. What the fuck am I doing talking about this? Anyways, Penn, I guess thanks for the private show, man. Fucking no. Now, how ridiculous would it be if I ended the first part of a 2-part video series on the effectiveness of VR as a learning platform with an anecdote about Penn Jillette? Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you. All jokes aside, I do have a couple of personal and also logistical reasons that I kind of want to release this video as a 2-parter, so just know that the whole video is written, and by the time you're seeing this, I'm probably well into working on part 2. So yeah, just please stay tuned, and you know, you may have noticed a little bit of my foreshadowing. The next part's going to take a little bit more of a serious turn. I will be retreading old ground, but, you know, with new boots. Thank you for watching. Here, EMF5 down the hall.
Okay, I'm fixing to try to get her to chase me, and I'm gonna run in this bathroom, so y'all may not want to be in there. I'm fixing to sacrifice myself.
Oh goodness. You don't need to do this.
It's the only way I know to try to get her in that bathroom.
If you do that, I will come in and take a picture of your body for the insurance.
If it's on professional, I won't get any. But I only added 1 or 2 things, so I won't be losing a lot.
Alright.
Mary White, please give us dirty water.
Okay, we'll stand here at the room to give you a chance to guide her in, I guess. So you remember where it is. Maybe we should leave a...
Mary White, come on, you little bitch. Come on, Mary White.
Oh shit! That worked. Hide in this room. Hide in this room. Hide in this room.
Oh my god, it worked. Oh my god, run.
Come on, Mary
Here,
White.
here.
Come on, Mary White.
Wait, don't go.
Let's
Close
go
the door,
play with
close the
some
door.
water.
Come inside. No, don't go inside.
Come on,
Don't
Mary
go
White,
inside.
I'm not even